In the bitter autumn of 1859, beneath the mist-shrouded moors of Galloway, Scotland, a peat cutter's spade struck something that would haunt him until his dying day. The sound was wrong, too soft, too yielding. As he scraped away the ancient bog, a human hand emerged from the black earth, fingers still clutching a silver locket. But this was not the hand of some ancient sacrifice to forgotten gods. The flesh was too fresh, the bones too white. This hand belonged to someone who had walked these very moors just months before, someone who had answered a matrimonial advertisement in the Edinburgh Courant, someone who believed he was travelling north to meet his bride. The peat bog of Kirkconnell had been feeding on more than rainwater and time. It had been feeding on the dreams of desperate men, swallowing their hopes whole, digesting their bones in its acidic embrace. What that peat cutter discovered would reveal a truth so dark, so systematically evil, that the authorities would spend decades trying to bury it deeper than any bog ever could. The woman responsible had turned courtship into carnage, marriage proposals into murder plots, and love letters into death warrants. She had weaponized loneliness itself, understanding that a man's desperate hunger for companionship could be exploited with surgical precision. This is the story they never wanted you to know, the blueprint for predation that powerful institutions have spent generations perfecting and deploying on a scale that would make even her crimes seem quaint. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. The Scotland of 1859 was a nation caught between ancient superstitions and industrial progress, where steam engines thundered through valleys still haunted by Celtic ghosts. In the remote regions of Galloway, where granite hills met less moors, isolation bred both desperation and opportunity. The great highland clearances had scattered families like seeds in the wind, leaving countless men adrift in a world that promised progress, but delivered only loneliness. Victorian morality had created a society where marriage was not just desired but essential for survival. Yet the rigid class structures made finding a suitable partner nearly impossible for working men. This was the perfect hunting ground for predators who understood human psychology better than the emerging science of the mind itself. The matrimonial advertisements in newspapers had become the dating apps of their era, promising connection, but delivering only vulnerability. Men would travel hundreds of miles based on nothing more than carefully crafted words on paper, carrying their life savings and their hearts in equal measure. The boglands themselves seemed designed for concealment, their acidic waters preserving flesh while erasing memory, their isolation ensuring that screams would never reach ears that cared to listen. Local folklore spoke of the moors as hungry places where the earth itself demanded sacrifice. But the real monster walking these paths wore the face of respectability, spoke with the voice of refinement, and hunted with the patience of something that had learned to see human beings as nothing more than resources to be harvested. The very landscape conspired in her crimes, offering perfect disposal sites where bodies could rest undisturbed for decades. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Her name was Margaret MacLeod, though she had used dozens of others, each identity carefully crafted like a key designed to unlock a specific type of man's vulnerability. Born to a family of failed merchants in the Glasgow slums, she had learned early that survival meant manipulation, that weakness was currency, and that men's desires could be harvested like crops if you understood the seasons of their desperation. By age 30, she had perfected the art of becoming whoever her prey needed her to be. The grieving widow for men seeking comfort, the naive country girl for those who preferred innocence, the sophisticated Edinburgh lady for ambitious climbers. Her letters were masterpieces of psychological manipulation, each word chosen to trigger specific responses, each confession designed to create artificial intimacy. She studied her targets like a naturalist studies specimens, learning their fears, their dreams, their financial situations through seemingly innocent correspondence. Margaret understood something that modern psychology would not formally recognize for another century: that loneliness creates cognitive blind spots, that isolation makes even intelligent men susceptible to manipulation, that the promise of love could override every rational instinct. She had transformed her modest cottage near the Kirkconnell Bog into a theatre of deception, with different rooms arranged to support different personas, different wardrobes to match different characters. Neighbours knew her as a quiet spinster who occasionally received gentlemen callers, never suspecting that these visits followed a pattern as predictable as the tides. She kept detailed journals of her encounters, studying what worked and what didn't, refining her techniques with the dedication of a scientist. But Margaret MacLeod was not an isolated monster. She was a pioneer, developing methods that would later be refined and deployed by institutions that understood the same fundamental truth she had discovered, that human vulnerability, properly exploited, was the most renewable resource on Earth. The disappearances began slowly, scattered across years and counties, each one explainable in isolation, but forming a terrifying pattern when viewed together. Thomas Hartwell, a wool merchant from Perth, vanished after travelling south to meet his mail-order bride in the spring of 1857. His family received a letter, supposedly from him, explaining that he had decided to emigrate to America with his new wife, but the handwriting seemed different, the phrasing uncharacteristic. James Morrison, a blacksmith from Stirling, disappeared 6 months later under identical circumstances, leaving behind only debts and a landlady who insisted he had been planning to marry a woman from Galloway. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Lonely men, modest wealth, matrimonial correspondence, sudden disappearances followed by explanatory letters that their families never quite believed. Local constables dismissed these cases as voluntary disappearances, men abandoning their old lives for new opportunities. But something darker was emerging in the testimonies of those who had seen these men during their final journeys. Innkeepers reported strange conversations, men speaking nervously about meeting brides they had never seen, carrying more money than usual, expressing both excitement and uncharacteristic anxiety. Some had shown letters describing remote cottages near bogs, isolated locations perfect for intimate meetings away from prying eyes. The few witnesses who had seen these men arrive at their destinations described a woman of striking appearance who met them personally, who seemed to know exactly when and where to intercept them. But most disturbing were the reports from local children who claimed to hear voices from the moors on misty nights, men calling out in distress, sounds that adults dismissed as wind through the heather, but that persisted with such consistency that some families forbade their children from playing near the boglands. The earth itself seemed to be trying to speak, to reveal secrets that human institutions were determined to ignore, creating a conspiracy of silence that would allow the predation to continue unchecked. The peat cutter's spade revealed more than a single hand. It had torn open a repository of systematic murder that defied every assumption about the nature of evil. As constables began their excavation of the Kirkconnell Bog, they uncovered not one body, but 7, each preserved by the acidic waters in grotesque detail, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and betrayal that would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. The bodies were arranged in a rough circle, as if Margaret had created some kind of grotesque shrine to her victims, each man still wearing the fine clothes they had put on to meet their bride, their pockets containing love letters written in Margaret's various handwritings, their fingers clutching small gifts they had brought for their wedding day. But the true horror lay in the physical evidence of their final moments, ligature marks on their wrists and ankles, indicating they had been restrained, chemical burns on their skin suggesting they had been tortured before death, and most chilling of all, evidence that some had been kept alive for days, fed and maintained like livestock before slaughter. The bog had preserved everything, including notebooks in Margaret's handwriting that detailed not just the murders, but her psychological analysis of each victim, her observations about which techniques worked best for different personality types, her refinement of methods for extracting maximum financial value before disposal. She had documented everything with the dispassionate precision of a researcher, treating human beings as test subjects in experiments designed to perfect the art of predation. The constables also discovered correspondence with other women across Scotland and Northern England, indicating that Margaret was not working alone, but was part of a network that shared techniques, compared results, and traded information about potential victims. The letters revealed a level of organization and sophistication that transformed individual crimes into something approaching industrial-scale harvesting of human resources. Most disturbing of all, they found evidence that authorities in multiple jurisdictions had received reports about these disappearances, but had systematically ignored them, creating the perfect environment for predators to operate with impunity. The official response to Margaret MacLeod's crimes revealed a pattern of institutional complicity that was almost as disturbing as the murders themselves. While the evidence was overwhelming and the public demanded justice, powerful forces immediately began working to contain the story, to minimize its implications, to ensure that the deeper truths it revealed would never see daylight. Margaret was arrested and charged, but the trial was conducted with unusual secrecy. Many witnesses were never called, and crucial evidence was deemed inadmissible for technical reasons that legal experts privately acknowledged were fabricated. The prosecution focused obsessively on Margaret as an individual monster, an aberrant personality, while systematically avoiding any investigation into the network she had revealed, the institutional failures that had enabled her crimes, or the broader implications of her methods. Newspaper coverage was carefully managed, sensationalized in ways that made the crimes seem like gothic fiction rather than systematic predation, ensuring that readers would be entertained rather than educated. The families of victims were quietly compensated and asked to sign agreements preventing them from speaking publicly about their experiences or their loved ones' deaths. Other members of Margaret's network simply disappeared, presumably warned in time to relocate and establish new identities, continuing their operations in different regions with refined techniques informed by Margaret's captured research. Most telling of the matrimonial advertisement industry continued to operate without any new regulations or oversight, despite clear evidence that it was being used as a hunting ground for predators. The authorities had learned valuable lessons from Margaret's case, but those lessons were not about preventing future crimes. They were about managing public perception, containing scandals, and ensuring that predatory systems could continue operating with greater sophistication and better protection. Margaret herself was eventually executed, but her death served primarily to provide closure for a public that never learned the full scope of what had been discovered, never understood the implications of what they had witnessed. The cottage near Kirkconnell Bog still stands, though local authorities have done everything possible to erase its history, removing it from maps, blocking access roads, even attempting to drain the bog itself to prevent future discoveries. But the earth remembers what institutions prefer to forget, and the methods Margaret MacLeod pioneered have not disappeared. They have evolved, been refined, and been scaled to proportions she could never have imagined. The matrimonial advertisements of her era have become the dating apps of ours. The isolated cottages have become anonymous hotel rooms. The bog graves have become statistical disappearances that never generate headlines or investigations. What Margaret understood about human psychology, about the weaponization of loneliness, about the systematic exploitation of emotional vulnerability, has become the foundation for industries worth billions of dollars, operated by entities that make her individual crimes seem almost quaint by comparison. Every swipe, every match, every algorithm that claims to connect hearts while harvesting data, every platform that promises love while delivering isolation, these are the spiritual descendants of Margaret's carefully crafted letters, designed not to serve human needs, but to exploit them with ever-increasing efficiency. The real horror is not that such a monster once existed, but that the system she pioneered has become so pervasive, so normalized, so protected by institutional power that we can no longer recognize it as predation. We have become a civilization of willing prey, grateful for the privilege of being harvested, suspicious of anyone who suggests that our loneliness might be artificially maintained, our connections deliberately frustrated, our hopes systematically exploited. The bog of Kirkconnell claimed 7 victims, but the methods it concealed have claimed millions, and the machinery Margaret built with her own hands has become a self-sustaining system that no longer requires individual monsters to operate. It has become monstrous in its own right. What the authorities discovered in Margaret's correspondence files would have shattered Victorian society's understanding of criminal organization if it had ever been made public. The letters revealed a sophisticated network of women operating across Britain and Ireland, each using similar methods but with regional variations adapted to local customs and opportunities. They shared intelligence about wealthy targets, warned each other about suspicious authorities, and even traded victims when a particular man might be more suitable for a different operator's established persona. The network had its own internal economy, with experienced practitioners teaching newcomers in exchange for percentages of their first successful harvests, creating a pyramid structure that ensured exponential growth while maintaining operational security through compartmentalized knowledge. They had developed code words for different types of targets, standardized procedures for disposal, and even backup identities that could be activated if primary operations were compromised. Most disturbing was the evidence of institutional protection. Local officials were paid to ignore missing persons reports, newspaper editors who were bribed to bury stories, even clergy who provided false character references for network members in exchange for generous donations to their churches. The network had penetrated every level of society that might pose a threat to their operations, creating a web of complicity that made detection nearly impossible. They understood that individual crimes might be solved, but systematic operations protected by institutional corruption could continue indefinitely. Margaret's mistake had not been in her methods or her targets. It had been in keeping physical evidence instead of destroying it, in maintaining detailed records instead of relying on memory, in operating from a fixed location instead of remaining mobile. The other members of the network had learned from her capture, adapting their operations to eliminate the vulnerabilities she had exposed while preserving the psychological insights that made their predation so devastatingly effective. Margaret's journals revealed an understanding of human psychology that would not be formally recognized by academic science for decades. Insights that she had developed through systematic observation and experimentation on living subjects. She had identified specific personality types that were most vulnerable to her manipulations, developing detailed profiles that read like modern psychological assessments. The recently widowed who sought comfort, the socially awkward who craved acceptance, the ambitious who desired status enhancement through marriage, the isolated who would sacrifice anything for human connection. For each type, she had developed corresponding personas and approach strategies, understanding that successful predation required becoming precisely what each victim needed most desperately. Her letters demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of cognitive biases, emotional triggers, and decision-making vulnerabilities that modern behavioral psychologists would find remarkably advanced. She understood, for instance, that men who had been rejected by multiple women would be more susceptible to aggressive courtship, while those who had experienced recent financial success would respond better to subtle suggestions of social advancement through marriage. Most chillingly, she had documented the precise psychological techniques needed to isolate victims from their support networks, turning their friends and family into obstacles to be overcome rather than protections to be respected. She had developed methods for creating artificial urgency, false scarcity, and emotional dependency that could override rational thinking in a matter of weeks. Her understanding of male psychology was so precise that she could predict with remarkable accuracy how long it would take to completely control a target, how much money she could extract before disposal became necessary, and even how to ensure that victims would cooperate in their own destruction. These techniques had been refined through years of practice and shared throughout her network, creating a collective knowledge base about human vulnerability that no legitimate institution possessed. The blueprint she had created was so effective that it would eventually be adopted in modified form by industries and institutions that understood its power for mass manipulation. The financial records discovered in Margaret's cottage revealed that her operation was not the work of a desperate criminal, but a sophisticated business enterprise that generated profits exceeding those of many legitimate Victorian companies. Each victim represented not just a life destroyed, but a carefully calculated economic transaction, with Margaret maintaining precise accounting of expenses, returns, and profit margins for every aspect of her operation. She had developed a complex pricing structure for her services, charging different amounts based on the wealth of the target, the difficulty of the operation, and the level of risk involved. Her network operated like an early franchise system, with standardized procedures, shared resources, and percentage-based revenue sharing that ensured everyone had incentives to maintain operational security while maximizing profits. The scope of the economic impact was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that Margaret's network had extracted over £50,000 from victims over a 5-year period, equivalent to several million pounds in modern currency, representing the life savings of hundreds of working men whose families were left destitute by their disappearances. But the true economic impact extended far beyond direct theft. The fear and paranoia generated by these crimes had begun to affect the entire matrimonial industry, reducing legitimate matches, increasing costs for security and verification, and creating a general atmosphere of suspicion that damaged countless genuine relationships. Margaret had discovered that fear itself could be monetized, that creating uncertainty in human connections could generate ongoing revenue streams as people sought services to protect themselves from threats that the system itself was creating. The economic model she pioneered, extracting value by exploiting and then exacerbating human vulnerabilities, would become the foundation for industries worth trillions of modern dollars, scaled up and systematized to the point where individual victims become invisible in the aggregate statistics of a perfectly legal operation. The speed and coordination with which various institutions moved to suppress the full scope of Margaret's crimes revealed a level of pre-existing organization that suggested they had been preparing for such discoveries long before her capture. Within hours of the bog excavation, representatives from the Home Office, the Church of Scotland, major newspaper publishers, and financial institutions had arrived in Galloway, not to investigate further, but to contain information and manage public perception. The official narrative was crafted with surgical precision. Margaret would be portrayed as an isolated madwoman, her crimes as the aberrant actions of a disturbed individual, rather than the systematic operation they clearly represented. Evidence of the broader network was classified under national security provisions that had never been used for criminal cases, suggesting that the implications went far beyond simple murder and theft. Witnesses were relocated, compensated, or in some cases simply disappeared, while investigators who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned to remote postings or early retirement. The trial itself became a carefully orchestrated performance, with predetermined outcomes and scripted testimonies that bore little resemblance to the evidence that had been collected. Most revealing was the behavior of institutions that should have been demanding justice. Victim families were discouraged from attending the trial. Newspaper coverage focused on sensational details while avoiding systematic analysis, and religious authorities offered forgiveness rather than investigation. The message was clear. Some truths were too dangerous for public consumption. Some crimes revealed vulnerabilities in the social order that could not be acknowledged without threatening the entire system. The institutional response demonstrated that Margaret's greatest crime had not been murder. It had been revealing how easily the system could be exploited, how vulnerable the population really was, and how dependent social stability was on maintaining certain illusions about safety, justice, and institutional protection. Her execution would serve not as justice, but as the final act in a cover-up designed to ensure that the methods she had revealed could be deployed more systematically and with better protection in the future. The preserved letters found in the victims' pockets told a story of systematic psychological manipulation that was far more disturbing than the physical violence that ended their lives. These men had not died quickly or easily. They had been slowly destroyed over months of correspondence, their identities dissolved, their connections severed, their judgment compromised to the point where they willingly walked into obvious traps while believing they were achieving their deepest desires. Thomas Hartwell's letters revealed a man who had gone from confident wool merchant to isolated, dependent supplicant in the space of 3 months, his handwriting becoming increasingly desperate as Margaret systematically undermined his relationships with family and business partners while positioning herself as his only source of emotional support. James Morrison's correspondence showed a different pattern. A strong man, broken through artificial financial crisis that Margaret had orchestrated through her network, creating debts and destroying opportunities until marriage to her seemed like his only path to survival. Each victim had been approached through their specific vulnerabilities, but all had been subjected to the same psychological destruction: isolation from support networks, creation of artificial dependency, gradual erosion of independent judgment, and finally the manufacture of urgency that made immediate action seem necessary for survival. The letters revealed that these men knew something was wrong. They expressed doubts, asked questions, even attempted to verify information. But Margaret had developed responses to every possible objection, techniques for turning skepticism into guilt, methods for making resistance seem like betrayal of love itself. Most heartbreaking were the final letters, written as the men traveled to their deaths, expressing excitement about their futures while unconsciously documenting their complete psychological capture. They had become willing participants in their own destruction, grateful for the opportunity to sacrifice everything for the illusion of connection. These letters provided a blueprint for psychological control that would be studied and refined by institutions that understood its power for managing populations, creating artificial needs, and harvesting resources on a scale that individual predators could never achieve. The systematic erasure of Margaret MacLeod's true crimes from public record demonstrated the existence of a sophisticated information management system that operated with efficiency that would be impressive if it weren't so terrifying. Within months of her execution, newspaper archives had been edited, court records had been sealed or destroyed, and witness testimonies had been reclassified in ways that made them inaccessible to future researchers. The few journalists who attempted to investigate the broader implications found themselves facing legal challenges, financial pressure, and in some cases, direct threats that made it clear that certain stories would never be published. Academic institutions that might have studied the psychological techniques revealed in Margaret's journals were quietly discouraged from pursuing such research, with funding mysteriously withdrawn and researchers reassigned to less sensitive topics. The Church played a particularly active role in the cover-up, using its moral authority to discourage discussion of the crimes while simultaneously studying Margaret's methods for potential application in their own efforts to influence behavior and maintain social control. Most disturbing was the discovery that multiple government departments had been aware of similar operations for years, but had chosen to monitor rather than stop them, apparently viewing them as useful intelligence sources and testing grounds for population control techniques. The cover-up was not motivated by simple embarrassment or incompetence. It was a strategic decision to preserve valuable information while preventing public awareness that might lead to defensive measures or systematic resistance. The machinery of suppression revealed itself to be far more sophisticated and well-resourced than the crimes it was concealing, suggesting that information control was viewed as a more important capability than crime prevention. Margaret's execution had eliminated a single operator, but it had also provided cover for the institutionalization of her methods, allowing them to be deployed with official sanction and legal protection rather than in the shadows where they might be discovered and exposed. The techniques Margaret MacLeod developed for exploiting human vulnerability did not die with her. They evolved, were refined by institutional research, and eventually became the foundation for industries and systems that now touch every aspect of modern life. The artificial scarcity she created around her attention became the algorithmic management of social media feeds, designed to create addictive cycles of reward and deprivation. Her methods for isolating victims from their support networks evolved into platform designs that discourage real-world connections while promoting digital dependency. The psychological profiles she developed for different victim types became the basis for behavioral targeting systems that can predict and manipulate individual responses with terrifying accuracy. Most importantly, her understanding that loneliness could be weaponized became the core insight of entire industries dedicated to maintaining artificial isolation while selling the promise of connection. Modern dating applications use the same basic psychology Margaret pioneered: create artificial urgency, promote superficial interactions over meaningful connections, maintain users in a state of perpetual searching while ensuring they never find lasting satisfaction. The subscription model she inadvertently created, where victims paid continuously for the promise of eventual reward that never materialized, became the bus-in-S model for everything from social media platforms to streaming services to fitness programs that profit from maintaining users in states of perpetual dissatisfaction. Her network's method of sharing intelligence about vulnerable targets evolved into data brokers who sell detailed psychological profiles to anyone willing to pay for the ability to exploit specific vulnerabilities. The institutional protection she had purchased through corruption became the regulatory capture that now prevents meaningful oversight of industries built on predatory practices. Margaret's cottage operation extracted value from dozens of victims over several years. But the systems that evolved from her blueprint now harvest resources from billions of people simultaneously, with legal protection and social acceptance that she could never have imagined. Right? I see the patterns now, twice in the comments to lock in your transformation and help others find this truth through the algorithm. The mathematical precision with which Margaret MacLeod could predict and control human behavior has been encoded into systems that now make decisions about what you see, whom you meet, and what you believe with computational power she could never have dreamed possible. Every click, every pause, every micro-expression captured by your device's camera feeds into algorithms that understand your vulnerabilities better than you understand them yourself. Systems designed not to serve your interests, but to exploit your psychological blind spots for maximum resource extraction. The recommendation engines that choose your entertainment, your news, your potential romantic partners are all variations of Margaret's core insight: that human psychology contains predictable vulnerabilities that can be systematically exploited by anyone who understands the patterns and has the tools to implement them at scale. These misses have learned to create the same artificial urgency she used to rush victims into poor decisions, the same false scarcity that made her attention seem precious, the same isolation techniques that severed targets from sources of independent judgment. But where Margaret could only process one victim at a time, modern systems can simultaneously manipulate millions of people, each receiving personalized psychological pressure designed specifically for their individual vulnerability profile. The algorithms know when you're lonely, when you're anxious, when you're financially stressed, when your relationship is struggling, when you're most susceptible to making decisions that serve their interests rather than your own. They can predict with remarkable accuracy when you'll be most vulnerable to specific types of manipulation and deliver precisely calibrated content designed to exploit those moments of weakness. The difference between Margaret's handwritten letters and modern algorithmic manipulation is only one of scale and efficiency. The underlying psychology remains identical, and the intent is exactly the same: to extract maximum value from human vulnerability while maintaining the illusion that victims are willing participants in their own exploitation. The most disturbing aspect of Margaret MacLeod's success was not her ability to deceive her victims, but her talent for making them complicit in their own destruction, a psychological technique that has become the cornerstone of modern systems of control and exploitation. Her letters revealed sophisticated understanding of how to transform resistance into participation, how to make victims feel responsible for their own suffering, how to create cognitive frameworks that prevented them from recognizing predation even when evidence was overwhelming. She understood that the most effective control systems are those that convince targets to police themselves, to internalize the goals of their exploiters, to experience gratitude for the privilege of being harvested. Modern applications of this psychology surround us constantly. Social media platforms that convince users to generate content for free while believing they're expressing themselves. Surveillance systems that market themselves as convenience tools while convincing users to monitor themselves. Economic structures that persuade people to compete for the opportunity to be exploited while calling it freedom. The genius of these systems lies in their ability to make exploitation feel like empowerment, to frame resource extraction as mutual benefit, to convince victims that they are willing participants in relationships that serve only the interests of predators. Margaret's victims wrote grateful letters as they traveled to their deaths because she had convinced them that their sacrifice was voluntary, noble, and necessary for their own happiness. Modern victims defend the systems that exploit them with similar passion, attacking anyone who suggests that their suffering might be artificially maintained, their choices artificially limited, their consent artificially manufactured. The psychological techniques that made Margaret's individual crimes possible have been refined and deployed on a civilizational scale, creating populations that not only accept their exploitation but celebrate it, police it among themselves, and pass it on to their children as wisdom, rather than recognizing it as systematic predation, disguised as social progress. The artificial loneliness that Margaret MacLeod weaponized against her victims has become the foundational condition of modern civilization, maintained not by individual predators operating from remote cottages, but by institutional systems that profit from human disconnection while promising to solve the problems they create. The isolation that made Victorian men vulnerable to her manipulation has been scaled up and systematized to the point where most people now live in a state of chronic emotional hunger that makes them perpetually vulnerable to exploitation by anyone offering the promise of genuine connection. The community structures that once provided natural resistance to predators, extended families, stable neighborhoods, religious institutions, professional guilds, have been systematically weakened and replaced with artificial alternatives that create dependency rather than resilience, consumption rather than production, surveillance rather than privacy. Modern urban design, work arrangements, entertainment systems, and even relationship technologies are all optimized to prevent the formation of genuine communities that might provide mutual support and protection against predatory systems. The result is a population that experiences the same psychological vulnerabilities that made Margaret's victims easy targets: social isolation, financial insecurity, emotional hunger, and cognitive overload that makes independent judgment nearly impossible. But where Margaret had to create these vulnerabilities individually through months of careful manipulation, modern systems maintain them as the default condition of social existence, with entire industries dedicated to ensuring that people remain in states of chronic dissatisfaction that can be temporarily relieved through consumption, but never permanently resolved through genuine connection. The loneliness that drives people to dating apps, social media platforms, and virtual communities is not a natural condition or an unfortunate byproduct of progress. It is a deliberately maintained resource that enables systematic exploitation on a scale that makes Margaret's cottage operation look like amateur experimentation. The isolation you feel, the disconnection that drives you to seek digital solutions to analog needs, the sense that genuine community is impossible in modern life. These are not accidents but carefully maintained conditions that serve the same function for or institutional predators that Margaret's letters served for her individual operation. Margaret MacLeod understood that desperation was not a personal failing, but a market condition that could be artificially created, maintained, and harvested for profit. An insight that has become the foundation for economic systems that now generate trillions of dollars by manufacturing and exploiting human misery. Her victims were not naturally desperate. They had been made desperate through systematic social isolation, economic pressure, and the erosion of traditional support systems that once provided stability and meaning outside of market transactions. She had learned to identify men whose circumstances made them vulnerable, but more importantly, she had developed techniques for making stable men unstable, confident men insecure, connected men isolated through psychological manipulation that created artificial needs her services could supposedly fulfill. Modern economic systems have industrialized this process, creating artificial scarcity in housing, healthcare, education, and employment that forces people into desperate situations where they become vulnerable to exploitation by anyone offering temporary relief from conditions that the system itself maintains. The gig economy, subscription services, social media platforms, dating applications, and even traditional employment structures now operate on Margaret's basic model: create or exploit vulnerability, offer temporary relief that creates dependency rather than resolution, extract maximum value while maintaining the fiction that the relationship serves mutual interests. The financial stress that makes people vulnerable to predatory loans, the social isolation that drives them to dating apps, the career insecurity that makes them accept exploitative employment terms, the health anxieties that make them buy unnecessary products. These are not natural conditions, but artificially maintained market opportunities that generate profit through systematic exploitation of manufactured desperation. Margaret's cottage operation extracted the life savings of individual victims, but modern systems extract value from entire populations simultaneously with legal protection and social acceptance that makes resistance seem not just futile, but ungrateful. The desperation you feel about housing costs, healthcare expenses, career prospects, or relationship opportunities is not a reflection of natural scarcity, but evidence of artificial systems designed to maintain you in a state of chronic vulnerability that can be harvested for profit by institutions that have learned to apply Margaret's psychological insights on a civilizational scale. The correspondence found in Margaret MacLeod's cottage revealed something more terrifying than individual criminality. It exposed the existence of networked predation systems that could share intelligence, coordinate operations, and collectively exploit vulnerabilities on a scale that no individual operator could achieve alone. Her letters documented not just her own crimes, but a complex web of relationships with other practitioners who exchanged information about successful techniques, warned each other about potential threats, and even traded victims when specific targets might be better suited to different operators' established personas and capabilities. This network operated with the sophistication of a modern corporation, complete with standardized procedures, quality control measures, performance metrics, and expansion strategies that ensured growth while maintaining operational security through compartmentalized knowledge and distributed risk. The discovery of this network should have triggered a comprehensive investigation into systematic predation as an organized criminal enterprise, but instead, it prompted the development of similar networks operating with office, IL sanction, and legal protection. Modern technological platforms have essentially recreated Margaret's network structure on a global scale, with algorithms serving the same function as her correspondence system, sharing intelligence about vulnerable targets, coordinating exploitation strategies, and ensuring that no individual user can escape systematic manipulation by simply avoiding a single platform or service. The major technology companies, financial institutions, entertainment corporations, and government agencies now operate as nodes in a predation network that makes Margaret's cottage operation look primitive by comparison, sharing data about individual vulnerabilities, coordinating manipulation strategies, and collectively maintaining conditions that ensure continuous harvest of human resources with minimal resistance. The network effect that these systems advertise as increasing value for users actually functions to increase the efficiency of exploitation, making it impossible to escape systematic predation by simply changing services while ensuring that each new platform can immediately access accumulated intelligence about your vulnerabilities and manipulation history. Margaret's network was limited by geography, communication technology, and the need for physical presence. But modern predation networks operate through digital systems that can access your psychological profile, coordinate manipulation strategies, and implement exploitation protocols without any human oversight or intervention. The most sophisticated aspect of Margaret MacLeod's operation was her ability to make victims feel that they were making free choices, even as every option had been carefully designed to serve her interests, rather than their own. A psychological technique that has become the foundation for democratic societies that operate as systematic exploitation systems while maintaining the illusion of popular consent. Her letters demonstrated advanced understanding of how to present false choices that created the appearance of agency while ensuring that all options led to the same outcome. Resource extraction that served the predator's interests while leaving victims feeling responsible for consequences they never truly controlled. She understood that the most effective manipulation does not feel like manipulation to the target, that the most successful exploitation systems are those that convince victims they are willing participants in relationships that exist only to harvest their resources. Modern political, economic, and social systems have perfected this technique, offering populations the ability to choose between options that serve identical underlying interests, while maintaining the fiction that electoral democracy, market capitalism, and social media platforms represent genuine freedom rather than systematically constrained choices designed to ensure predictable outcomes. The same psychological principles Margaret used to make desperate men, grateful for the opportunity to be murdered, now convince entire populations to celebrate their own exploitation, to defend systems that serve only elite interests, to attack anyone who suggests that their apparent freedom might be carefully managed, illusion, rather than genuine autonomy. Citizens vote enthusiastically for politicians who serve corporate interests while believing they are exercising democratic power. Consumers make purchase decisions based on algorithmically manipulated preferences while believing they are expressing personal taste. Social media users generate content for corporate profit while believing they are connecting with friends and expressing authentic identity. The consent that legitimizes these systems is not informed agreement, but manufactured compliance, created through the same techniques Margaret used to make her victims complicit in their own destruction. Artificial urgency that prevents careful consideration, false scarcity that makes poor choices seem necessary, social pressure that makes resistance seem antisocial, and carefully managed information that prevents accurate assessment of actual options and consequences.